I was walking down my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
Welcome back to another episode of NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. My name's Dr. Timothy Christie.
And I'm Matthew Martin.
And we have a great episode for you today. But before we start, I'd like to just remind people of our action items. Here at NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action, we have specific calls to action that we're trying to challenge the government that we want them to do. The first thing we want them to do is have a public inquiry into systemic racism in New Brunswick. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today will show that there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, funny business going on in New Brunswick that needs to be brought to the forefront and needs to be exposed through the parameters of a public inquiry. And that means that the inquiry will have the ability to compel testimony, require people to testify under oath, so issue subpoenas, require documents be sent to them. And what we've seen in New Brunswick, this is going to be absolutely essential. The second thing that we want is Black education and Black history in the education system. And by this, what we mean is not just a history of some of the accomplishments or some of the amazing accomplishments that Black people have done, but a critical race theory perspective. We want critical race theory to be taught in the education system. We want people to be able to look at some of the white supremacist policies and foundations of our country and understand how people are still being impacted by those policies and decisions today. Then the third thing we want in New Brunswick is for racial discrimination to be a crime. Right now, racial discrimination is considered under the Human Rights Act. And this is very problematic because we've gone through a lot of detail of what the problems are. But for instance, for other crimes, you can call the police will arrest someone, they will interrogate or interview the person, charge them, and even put them in jail. That process is not followed for racial discrimination. And if you think about the time when it was illegal for Black people to sit in a white-only section of a movie theater or on a bus, they certainly arrested us and certainly put us in jail. So what we're saying is the opposite is true. When racial discrimination happens, the punishment for that should be a crime as well. So the three action items that we want here at NBWA are a public inquiry, critical race theory and Black history in the education system, and then finally the making racial discrimination a crime. So Matthew, today's agenda, we have a few things to talk about, so would you like to take it?
Absolutely. So in our last episode, we took a brief moment and looked at the current legal action that's happening between the provincial government in 6 Indigenous communities across New Brunswick. And we said we were going to look a little further into that. And for today's episode, I'd like to discuss what's happening and kind of better explain it to individuals who may not be aware. So for folks who haven't heard, the government of New Brunswick had issued a letter out to its employees with an approved land acknowledgement for GMB employees. Now, with this land acknowledgement, it did not acknowledge the fact that the land that currently the government is in control over is unceded and unsurrendered. In the government-approved land acknowledgement, they removed that because of this current legal litigation that's happening over land titles within New Brunswick.
Right. So what's happened is the government are in court. They're being sued for land titles by some Indigenous groups here in New Brunswick. So part of their legal strategy or the legal advice they got was provincial employees should no longer acknowledge publicly in whatever venue they're going to be in that the territory we're on here in New Brunswick is unceded and unsurrendered. And this is part of their legal defense. So I guess we need to understand a little bit about what they're defending themselves against. And these groups in New Brunswick have long-standing treaties with the British Empire from the 1700s. And these treaties, like I said, go back to the 1700s, but they have implications for today. And one of them is that there's an economic relationship between Indigenous people and the province. And our current government have made relationships with our Indigenous groups so untenable that they had to go to court. So, for example, one of the main things in the relationships is economics, the use of resources in on their lands. And for example, on reserves, say you have a gas station. From the 1980s, I think, the communities have been collecting taxes on behalf of the government. It's not their job to collect tax on the government. When they sell gas, though, they collect a tax on the gas because that's in the price. Otherwise, the price of the gas on the reserve without the tax would be much lower than other places. So the government asked them to collect taxes, send it to the government, and the government reimbursed them a very good percentage of the taxes they collect. When the carbon tax came in, though, the government tried to pull a fast one. What they did was say, okay, the carbon tax is going to go, say, into the price of gas. We're going to put it in, we're going to reduce the provincial tax by that amount, and Indigenous communities, we're not going to reimburse you anymore. So now they're going to lose a lot of money that they were getting through negotiated agreements with the government, and the government all of a sudden decided, we're not going to do that. So this is one of the court cases, is saying we need to clarify and rectify this. Now, those are on reserve, and the government can't influence what's going on reserve. They can give money, they can negotiate, they can work with the chiefs and that type of thing. But what the government have said clearly through this, say, carbon tax maneuver that they had, is that we're not going to respect that. They went to court over the carbon tax thing, and the court said, government, you're wrong. So the government lost the case. Because of these sour relationships, though, these groups said, look, we are actually have 51% of the province, not just the reserves, but 51%. So if the government are going to be like that, we need to broaden our mandate. We need to have a broader spectrum so that we can force them to negotiate with us, and not only negotiate with us, but negotiate with us in good faith. So that's where these court cases came from, and that's what it's about. So it's not that the groups are saying all colonizers or all non-Indigenous people get off our land. That's not what they're saying. They're not talking about people who own property and live and work and that type of thing. What they're trying to do is clarify the relationship with government, because the government has been so disingenuous in their relationships with them. So it's hugely complicated, but it's something that is really important for people to understand, to appreciate where we end up in this really weird situation where the governments say, we're not going to acknowledge land title anymore, or land claims. And that brings us to one of the, I think, most important things of our show, where we talk about critical race theory. So maybe we could analyze this situation from a critical race theory perspective. Yeah, so just to give our viewers kind of a sense of what critical race theory is, and kind of how it came about. So in about the 70s, is kind of the first sign of we see critical race theory, which was put together by some American legal scholars. And in 2017, they kind of released a simplified definition of really what it is. And it's really just a collection of scholars and activists who want to critically look at the relationship between race, power, and education. Critical race theory wants to look at that relationship of our policies and laws that are currently in place, and the implications of how race and power have played throughout history, both in the past and as we move forward. Critical race theory isn't, looking at pitting, black individuals against white individuals, or pitting any type of racialized communities against our white communities, but it's saying, let's take a look at history, at policies that have taken place over, decades and centuries,
and analyze them to show how white community members have always systematically formed these systems to continue their colonization and their maintain their power. And it's not something that's ever discussed or looked at in any sense. It's really bypassed, and folks say that it's just trying to pit black individuals against white or indigenous against white individuals. But really what it's trying to do is, like I said, is to critically look at that relationship between race and power and those policies and laws that have been put in place to bring us to a society that we have today, that systemically benefits a white community member and disproportionately puts racialized community groups at a disadvantage.
Right. So an example, the first 100 years of Canada's existence, we had a white Canada immigration policy. Mm-hmm. So Canada would only accept immigrants from European countries that were predominantly white. Mm-hmm. They did this for 100 years, which means at some point, in the early 70s, 94% of the Canadian population was white. All the people living here thought it's just natural, it's obvious that Canada is just a white country. Well, it was a predominantly white country because it was designed to be that way through policies that excluded other groups. Mm-hmm. So critical race theory would challenge an assumption when Canadians say, oh, immigration is posing a threat to our identity, or the color of the country is changing. Critical race theory would say, no, it's not necessarily that it's posing a threat. It's that our identity is a fabricated identity. Mm-hmm. It's a false identity. It's an intentionally deliberate identity through immigration policies that people aren't aware of. But now we have a whole bunch of people that think it's just natural that we have a predominantly white country, and that might not be true. So critical race theory is this idea of trying to expose in a policy where it has foundations or fundamentals that are, say, white supremacist. And I think this is useful if we look at a little bit of the treaty stuff. I don't want to get into a whole lecture on the history of treaties, but before first contact, so say before Europeans contacted North America, there were people living here. Indigenous people were living here, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland, part of Maine, New England, even into Quebec. They were in the Atlantic region here, and they were living. And eventually, of course, North America is discovered, and it's a whole different discussion to say, how can you discover something where people are? Mm-hmm. It's new to you, but it's certainly not discovered. But there is a doctrine called the doctrine of discovery, which says if a white Christian European finds a place that is not white, Christian, and European, they can say they've discovered it in the name of whoever their sovereign is, so France, England, whomever it's going to be. So this doctrine of discovery is hugely problematic. But if we look at just the idea of first contact, initially, Europeans were fishing off the Atlantic coast. And then eventually they came on ground, and then eventually once they are on land, they start interacting with Indigenous people. And two things happened with first contact. First was the introduction of diseases that Indigenous people were never exposed to before. And depending on which sources you read, it seems like 50 to 90% of the population could have been wiped out by the introduction of disease over 2 generations. So just over a couple of generations. But the other thing that happened was introduction of trade. So the Europeans had a lot, they found that there was a huge market back in Europe for, say, furs and fish and resources that were here in abundance in North America. So they wanted to bring those back to Europe and sell them. And the Indigenous people here didn't have a manufacturing society. So they found great value in manufactured goods like guns, knives, axes, those types of things that can be manufactured. So now instead of hunting and gathering and fishing just to sustain them in their community, they would do a little bit more, following the principles of conservation, of course, but to be able to trade with the Europeans. But the Europeans also decided, we don't only want to stay trading with the indigenous people, we're going to bring our own people here. So we're going to bring our own fur traders. We're going to bring our own hunters. We're going to bring our own trappers. We're going to bring our own fishermen. And they came here and formed colonies. And these colonies were protected by military people. And these colonies started to expand. So at no point did the indigenous people say, come colonize us. The colonizers came and established colonies. Eventually, when the colonies started to spread so aggressively, the indigenous people engaged in a war with them. So there was fighting, there was violence going on. And the English in particular, the British, had a long-term strategy where they were trying to stop indigenous people from raiding their colonies and their settlements and their small establishments. So to do this, excuse me, they promised indigenous people more trade in exchange for the indigenous people to stop raiding their colonies. And these were called the Peace and Friendship Treaties from the 1700s. And these are the treaties that our indigenous people here signed back then. At no point do those treaties talk about our indigenous brothers and sisters giving up their land, ceding their land, surrendering their land. That's just not there. No scholar reading any of those treaties could logically or plausibly derive that conclusion. But this is the conclusion that our premier said that he wants to derive in radio interviews that I heard last week. This is the argument that our government are making when they're defending themselves against our indigenous brothers and sisters in court. They're saying our defense is that maybe those lands are ceded. Maybe they are surrendered. Maybe they're not unceded. Maybe they're not unsurrendered. And obviously anybody looking at it would say they were not ceded, they were not surrendered. Anybody reading it will come to that conclusion. So the challenge that we have right now to our government is the defense they make against these accusations should use a critical race theory approach where you take out defenses based on white supremacy. And there is no doubt that the original people from Europe that came here were not invited. There's no doubt that they stole land. And I know that our current government didn't steal the land, but they've inherited stolen property. And they're administering stolen property. And they're entering into agreements with people who were here that they stole the property from. And that's just a fact. So one of the things that I find most disturbing about this court case is I want to look very carefully at what defense the government is giving. And I think the best advice we can give them is to have a true defense, to have an honest defense, have a defense that admits reality, that admits the racist history that we have. And yes, you have to defend yourself in court, but you've got to give something honest. And if we don't want to keep spinning and reiterating the past 300-400 years of injustices, someone now in leadership has to actually get real and get honest and submit an ethical defense, whatever that's going to be.
So I think it's important to acknowledge too that the land acknowledgements are true. The land is unceded, the land is unsurrendered. When we're looking at this, historically, it's already been said that the land was colonized. It was stolen. And so my question that I would have for the government is what are they expecting to come of this? Historically, we know the land was stolen, and our indigenous communities have already said that they're not looking, for financial gain for the land. They're not looking to kick anybody off the land. They want to share the land, but ultimately they want to be consulted on decisions that happen within the community on their land. This land is unceded and unsurrendered, and we've had generations of governments making decisions and raping the land without consulting our indigenous communities. And ultimately, this is all that the indigenous communities want, is to be consulted on what's happening on their lands, so that they can continue to flourish as a society outside of their reserves.
I think you're absolutely correct, Matthew. If you look at it, who's flourished from these treaties? It's the colonists, colonizers. Indigenous people, if we look at the statistics, poorer health outcomes, poor education outcomes, poorer outcomes on social determinants of health. They're overrepresented in the criminal justice system. They're shot and killed by police at disproportionate rates. Their kids are overrepresented in foster care. We're finding thousands of them killed and buried in unmarked graves in residential schools. Mm-hmm. So they're the ones that have been exploited, beaten, and killed as a result of these treaties, but they still hold up their end. They still are not attacking the communities. They're still not attacking the colonies, which is the original reason of the treaties. So to 100% effectiveness, they've still held up their end of the treaties, but they've been exploited by colonizers. And like I said, the games that our current government tried to play with the carbon tax and this type of thing are still happening. And this is why we need people in New Brunswick to be properly educated about critical race theory. And we need people in New Brunswick to have the open, transparent, honest results of a fair public inquiry into all of these things that are happening in New Brunswick. And the government defense against this claim, which they need to defend, and none of us can go back 400 years and fix what happened back in, say, the 1700s. We can't fix that. But they have an opportunity now. They're in a position, tell the truth, reason from the truth, reason from the facts, reason from an proper interpretation of history, and do not make sophistry arguments to try to defend yourself.
Before we wrap up today, Tim, I just want to express my kind of closing comments. If we look at Canada as a whole, we've put so much attention into recognizing our Indigenous communities and looking at truth and reconciliation. But if we look here in the province of New Brunswick and we look at the facts, we've seen the government terminate the tax revenue agreement between the Indigenous communities. We've seen the province of New Brunswick not recognizing the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and now we see our government in a legal battle with our Indigenous communities, and even with that, saying through this document that was released that the land is not unceded or unsurrendered. It makes me wonder, when is New Brunswick is going to take a serious look at itself and begin to recognize our Indigenous communities and actually recognize the truth that the land is unceded and unsurrendered and begin that reconciliation process? When is the government going to say, whether it's this government or our next, when is it that a government's going to say, enough's enough, this is ending with us, and we're going to truly begin this process of truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous communities? Any closing comments?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, Matthew. First, I agree with what you're saying. It's got to end with someone. Someone has to make a difference. Someone has to try to start making things right. And by blaming Indigenous people, by reasoning from stereotypes, by trying to do the things that our government have done to them, that's not going to work. Right now, our province's strategy for growth is immigration. Immigration is not going to be from only white countries. That policy is gone. So it's going to be a lot of ethnic diversity, which is a wonderful thing. But you can't bring people here if it's not a safe place for them to be, if it's a hostile environment, if our government is still systemically racist. So the things that they've done that you've explained, particularly this most ridiculous thing where they're not acknowledging that is unceded and unsurrendered, first, they should be ashamed of themselves. Go grow up, go read a history book, do something, but that's just incompetence, that's unforgivable. I can't condemn it in strong enough terms, and I'm not even going to try to explain all the things that are wrong with it because we've done it. The second thing I want to say as a concluding thought is, for God's sake, if you're going to go to court and you're going to defend yourself, tell the truth. Develop a real defense. And of course, there's no defense, there's no excusing colonization. So whatever they're going to argue in court, if it's going to be based on the truth, it's going to have to accept the brutal, racist history of colonization. Until our government can do that, until they can stand up like grown-ups in court and say, yes, we've inherited stolen land, and now we want to do the best we can, until they can do that, we're just going to keep hiding and burying deeper systemic racism in New Brunswick. So I think, once again, tell the truth, guys. Just get to work, be honest, be ethical, and tell the truth, and try to move forward in a constructive way.
Thank you, Dr. Christie. Well, folks, we'd like to thank you for tuning in for another episode of New Brunswickers Want Action, NBWA. If you have any comments or questions or topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can do so by emailing us at nbwa@chco.tv. My name is Matthew Martin. Black Lives Matter.